we are honored to have Dr. Thackery Brown, Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Center for Research and Education in Navigation, CRANE, as well as Memory Affect Planning Lab at Georgia Tech. Dr. Brown has a diverse range of neuroscientific research with a focus on memory and navigation. And the topic of his talk is Brain Without Borders, how manipulating barriers and environment structure shapes our memory for better and worse. So please join me welcoming Dr. Brown.
So it's a real pleasure to speak to this audience today. I wanted to start my talk off actually by giving you a little bit of an anecdote of some navigation experiences that I had recently. In the winter, I had the opportunity to go to a sort of a think tank amongst navigation researchers in Frankfurt. And while I was there, I got to partake in the wonderful Christmas markets they had, and it was a great time. I also went to their history museum here. And it's a very interesting museum. You can see from the outside, it's architecturally beautiful. It's rebuilt from an old building. It was damaged in the Second World War. But one thing that makes it really interesting is it's actually built on top of a medieval building in the town, as well as the original medieval port. And so there's sort of this old architecture embedded within this new building. So it's a very interesting place to visit. And they have, it's a great museum. I highly recommend going there. They have really nice exhibitions in this space. But one of the things I noticed while I was traveling around this building is that it was terrible for me as a navigator. So here are some shots of some things that really made this a difficult building for me to navigate. I mentioned before that this building is built on top of a medieval building. You can kind of see it in this picture here, that there's the old structure actually underneath an elevated walkway. And the old building might have walls going at one angle, and the walkway that I'm on is going at a different angle, and there's this sort of conflicting geometry, and the structures are built from different materials. You can also see that they came up with this kind of cute idea to put these columns instead of a solid wall that allowed you to sort of see a little bit into the next space. And all of this really made it a very visually interesting environment. It was quite an interesting space to explore, but actually I found it quite disorienting. You can see some other examples here where you're going up in these towers, going up in the tower in the old building, and you can see down multiple floors at once. And when you're looking at one thing, there's other people moving at different levels at the same time. There was just a lot going on. There are concepts that we look at in psychology, like the impact of optic flow on our ability to navigate. And that's essentially like how the visual information moves past your eyes, gives you information about your speed and angle that you're walking. And this kind of complexity is, it adds a lot of optic flow information, but when there are different geometries at the same time, it also introduces some conflict between this. So I found this to be actually an extremely difficult environment to navigate. And one of the things I kept thinking about is it's lucky that I do not have Alzheimer's yet, because there are a lot of individual differences in our ability to process complex spatial environments. And there are a lot of conditions like Alzheimer's disease where actually a hallmark of these conditions is difficulty processing optic flow and remaining oriented in complex environments. And so I was thinking about this in this museum as I was going through it and thinking, you know, this is a very interesting place to visit, highly recommended. On the other hand, this was not built in a sort of accessible way for the broad population. So, I have the animation here. I can control. So I had a great time visiting, and I would gladly go back again. But I wanted to sort of compare this experience with other approaches to architectural design around the world. For example, if we go to Singapore across the world, there's a large-scale urban project in the city to try and make this large environment more accessible to people with spatial memory and orientation deficits. And you can see some examples of this here where they've actually color-coded large swaths of the environment and put big numbers on them. And so you can see landmarks from a distance. They're not just a big building, but they're labeled in ways to help people from a distance kind of reorient themselves as they navigate through the space. And so this is meant to be, and there's a nice grid-like structure through much of the space as well, which you can kind of compare with the internal part of the museum. They've also done things like put really kind of simplistic graphics that help signify certain things to people from a distance. So here's a giant betta fish on the side of this building. There are also big murals that kind of signify the type of, so like if you're walking in this direction, you know you're heading towards places where there's cafes. And so this kind of thing is meant to make the city more accessible at sort of the big scale, but also like when you're down within the street, it's easier for you to sort of find your way around. And so I wanted to juxtapose these two experiences that you might have if you're a worldwide traveler, because there are sort of choices you could make about making an environment really interesting. And maybe one of the goals for the Frankfurt Museum was to help preserve and reveal the sort of historical structure. On the other hand, this can, if it's not done right, can actually disrupt the memorability and navigability of the space. As psychologists and neuroscientists, I would say we don't yet have a great understanding of when they do and do not conflict with each other. So, this is an example where it's actually an architecturally uninteresting building, in my opinion, but they have added some visual interest to it, as well as, so the betta fish serves to kind of make this more interesting, but it also is a signpost. Is this functionally equivalent to a navigator as like a beautiful architectural building like the museum, but it doesn't have any labels on it? We don't, that level of understanding, I think, is really lacking still. So with all of this in mind, I'm going to tell you about some very similar issues that Dr. Bafna brought up earlier, but kind of zoom in on the individual level. And I'm going to look at sort of the neuroscience of how we think we learn about the layout of space, and then some specific experiments that we played with, focusing in particular on barriers and the regularity of the geometry. So I'm not going to touch on actually this question of like, is a interesting mural equivalent to an interesting structure. That's not something that I've done. In fact, I think it's something that not many people have done. But I will look at the sort of value of the structure itself to our spatial memory. So let's start off by revisiting a little bit of the neuroscience that you were introduced earlier. Simin introduced this idea of a cognitive map, and that when we navigate an environment, we try to form some kind of understanding of the configural knowledge of the space. So where are the positions of things we're interested in relative to each other? And we usually learn that information through exploration and individual experiences. So if you take both of these routes, that's if you combine your memory for those two things, you can build some kind of configural knowledge of the space. If you only took one route, you would have less knowledge about the space. So we saw these types of neurons in the brain earlier already introduced. There's the grid cells, there are place cells, there are head direction cells, there's also the border cells. There are a number of neurons we've seen in the brain that respond when you're navigating like this. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on these grid cells, but you can try to measure these other signals from the human brain as well, and I'll show you some sort of teasers at the end related to the border cells. So the interesting thing about those neurons, they're all connected to each other. They're in neighboring parts of the brain and parts of the brain where the neurons are actually transmitting information back and forth. So if you put them together, it's tempting to say, hey, great, that's all the information I need to build a map of space. I could take a route like this, and when I navigate this route, I can keep track of the angles I've turned with my head direction cells. I can keep track of the places I've traveled with my place cells, and I could place them into a grid, some sort of metric information from the grid cells, and ta-da, I've mapped out that space in my memory. That's the idea that people have been very excited about. And just to sort of remind you, you can see it really visually with your eyes. If you take a grid cell like this, the reason people are really interested in this type of neuron is that this is a single cell that fires at multiple locations at a regular interval. So if you imagine a map like this, when people first discovered these cells, they were like, there it is. There are the grid lines on the map. This is telling me whenever the cell fires a second time, now I know I've gone 10 feet. And when it fires again, I've gone another 10 feet. So this might tell us that metric information we use to kind of understand the layout of our environment accurately. But there's a problem. These are extremely labile or fragile neural signals. For example, it's been found that if you take a square environment like this, the rat's running around and you get these nice grid cells, and you insert some new barriers. So that's what these white lines are. These are new walls in the environment. You insert these barriers, this pattern breaks up. And suddenly you get, this is a single neuron firing as well, but now it's firing in this sort of like almost linear way down the hallways. And it's not even firing in every hallway, it's firing every other hallway. So this suddenly, that map, the whole nature of the map is broken up and restructured. Another example that we've seen is what happens if you warp the environment in some funny way. And when I see this, I kind of think of my Frankfurt Museum example, where I've got a walkway going this angle, but there's a wall going at a slightly different angle, and just things aren't quite lined up in a parallel structure. And I don't know if you can see it very clearly here, but the grid cells actually are anchored to the boundaries. So when you warp the environment, the grid cells warp too. And it turns out that in this part of the environment, sort of where it's wider and more open, they still maintain a somewhat uniform distance, but it gets really warped more and more when you get into more narrow or severe extremes in the space, which suggests that the kind of metric unit information I could get from this might be okay-ish over here, but it's going to get really pretty distorted over here and unreliable. So this is pretty interesting to us because it suggests that, oh, sorry, here's an example of this. This is, you can kind of see in a square, this is sort of the nice rotational kind of metric information you would get from a grid cell normally. But if you kind of do some statistics on the warping in this space, you can see that the periodicity of the neural activity is actually distorted. So this really raises a problem for us as neuroscientists, because we thought, hey, we've found the information you use to map out the environment, but now we know that they actually break up and don't give you nice metric information at all in many real world kind of situations. It's quite common that you walk through a building with lots of hallways. It's quite common that you walk through buildings where architects have chosen to make some kind of interesting angles. And so does that tell us that these grid cells are actually useless? That's one possibility. They can't really give you this kind of map because they don't fire at a regular interval. Shoot, we have to start over and keep looking. That's one possibility. The other possibility, though, is that these cells have it right, and they are tracking the environment to the best that they can, and maybe our cognition is also getting warped and confused and distorted. And so maybe they are a good reflection of our internal map, and maybe our map itself is correspondingly bad. This is kind of where I'm leaning with the data we have so far, and I'll show you some some information to sort of support this idea. So with this in mind, that's sort of this neural background. What are some experiments we've done to sort of test how these types of barrier changes affect our memory for the space and how easy it might be to navigate? I'm going to start behaviorally, and then I'll go back to the brain data. So it turns out that our cognitive maps are in fact pretty terrible. And if you do psychology experiments in large open spaces and you have people make judgments about how far away something is or the angle, they're pretty good at it. And once you insert barriers, the error gets quite big quite quickly, especially when the knowledge is crossing a barrier. You can imagine in this room, even if you close your eyes, obviously you can see, that helps you, but if you close your eyes, you might still be pretty good at judging, the relative position of the coffee. But if the coffee was on the other side of the wall, you would immediately be way worse, even though it's only 8 feet different. So right off the bat, we actually have some psychology data to kind of align with these sort of observations we see with the neural data. Maybe there is good agreement. The other thing I want to point out, and I mentioned this earlier when I brought up Alzheimer's disease, is people are very different from each other. This is a distribution of errors in participants in my lab in their ability to point from this starting location to the end of the maze. And so they're here, and there's this kind of like there's this blue route through this environment, and we ask them point to the end of the maze, and you can see the angle error. And the average person is terrible. They're about 60 degrees off from the correct angle. Now, there are some people who are absolutely fantastic, and there's some people who are really, truly terrible. And these are healthy young adults. So now extrapolate that to something like Alzheimer's or a patient. So we really have a situation here where people's cognitive maps are bad, and there's a lot of variability in how bad they are. And I think it's important to think about that when we talk about the built environment and whether we're building something that's accessible and easy to navigate. So I'm going to show you an experiment, actually an experiment and a half, 2 studies, one of them kind of compressed, where we look at how we can sort of measure people's cognitive abilities like this and relate it to the structure of the environment itself. So Dr. Baffin introduced this already earlier, that barriers have a few different effects on our cognition. They can reduce our visibility, and you can measure that with tools like IsoVist, which is something I didn't know about when I ran this experiment I'm about to show you. But as you'll see, I'm essentially manipulating the IsoVist values of the space. They also reduce the affordances, so where you can go. Now, I'm not going to talk about affordances today, but one of the interesting things, or I'm not going to talk about manipulation of them directly, but it has been researched, and it's a cool opportunity with virtual reality because you can violate reality. You can make a barrier that completely obstructs your sight something you can just pass through like a ghost. You can also make something you can't pass through invisible and give people X-ray vision. So you can play with these things with VR, and that allows us to understand how visibility and affordances affect things like these neural signals. So it's the second one that I'm going to present to you now, and it's really kind of fortuitous that it aligns with concepts like IsoVist. So the question we asked in this study was, what role does the visibility of barriers play when we're trying to learn our way around an environment? And you can kind of flip this on its head and say, well, if we were somehow able to improve visibility, would that improve your ability to navigate around the environment? A bit like the Singapore strategy. Can we help people if we just know what we're doing when we turn the knobs on our environment design? So we had 2 ideas coming into this study. One of them is pretty obvious, I think, especially given the talks earlier and what I've shown you so far. Reduced visibility will hinder our direct perception of how things are related, and that's going to hurt our ability to learn an integrated kind of map of the space because you have to now infer them. over a route, you have to kind of hold in mind the angles, the distances you've traveled. And with that, you can infer how, far away an object on the other side of a wall is from where you are right now. The other idea, remember there's this vast variability in how good all of you actually are at this, is that good navigators might be the people who can use the cues they're given better to sort of infer the relationships in the environment. What that means, though, is that if we play around with the visibility, some people should actually benefit more than others, because when you change the visibility in the environment, you're opening up more spatial cues to people. But maybe if this is true, some people won't necessarily benefit from that. And as a teaser, that is, in fact, kind of what we see. So here's a very simple environment that we designed. We built these square buildings with different storefronts on them. And people were supposed to navigate around the environment and learn where the different stores are. And then we gave them X-ray vision. And so you can see here on the right, they can see through the building to the next store. And this allows people to directly perceive the relationship between the tobacco shop right in front of us and costume party on the other side. And I kind of think this is actually changing the isovist metrics in the environment, although again, that wasn't a concept that I was aware of at the time. But I also kind of relate this back to the Frankfurt Museum. This is a bit like, it's partially obstructed. It's a bit like those columns there. It's not a solid wall. You've let me see a little bit through, but it's not like a truly open room. So my affordances are still blocked, and my visibility is still impoverished a little bit, but I've opened it up a little bit to you. And the question is, what does this do to your ability to learn the layout of the environment? So this is an overhead view of the environment. So you can see all the 9 buildings here, and we had people navigate the environment. Then we tested them on their spatial memory. Then we had them navigate some more, and we tested them again in a second phase, just so we could sort of track how easy is it to learn this space. And then we had a different group learn the environment with X-ray vision through the same process. But the hook is, in general, anyone's going to do well with the X-ray vision if you test them on it, because they can see what they need to do. If I tell you go to costume party and you can see it, you're going to get there. So the thing we were really interested in was this idea of transferring your knowledge back to the real world. If you learn the environment with greater visibility, and then we take it away and we tell you, okay, how good is your cognitive map? Navigate in a realistic scenario where the walls are not translucent anymore, how well do you do? I think I actually have this animated. I'll just, you can just see the translucency happen. It was kind of an adaptive algorithm. So we had a ray trace from the front of their camera. And so the building they're looking at, they get the X-ray vision through it. Okay, and then we gave them 2 types of tests. Again, the tests were always in sort of the real world scenario. The walls are impenetrable and they are opaque. And so the question is, did improving the visibility help your learning? We tested them from kind of a navigation task where they had to navigate from point A to point B. And then we also had this pointing task where the environment's empty except for one cue. And we say point to where costume party is. And again, people are pretty bad at this in general. But there were 2 interesting observations. There's a measure that we applied to our participants called their sense of direction. It's actually a questionnaire. It's very easy to give to people. But it assesses their own, we call it metacognition, their own ability to evaluate their ability. And sense of direction specifically measures sort of how confident are you in your ability to use spatial cues. And we found that it's actually a really, I'm not a big user of questionnaires, but this is actually a really useful tool because it turns out that if you think you're bad at something, you probably avoid relying on that thing. And if you think you're good at something, you probably try to use that thing. So this is actually a really useful metric to get from our participants, because if they think that they are good at using spatial cues, they probably try to use spatial cues when they're learning. And that's where this plot shows the magic. If you look at the left, these are high sense of direction people. And if you compare how well they learn the layout of the environment in the opaque naturalistic situation, they do kind of poorly, sort of normal, but they actually become really good if they learn with the X-ray vision scenario. But remember, we're not testing them with X-ray vision. So this is really about the map they formed in their memory. And now they're going out into the real world, quote unquote, and they're showing us that they have a better memory. But that's not true for the low sense of direction people. People with a low sense of direction who aren't very confident in their ability to attend to the right cues and integrate them, they don't actually benefit from the translucency. In fact, this is only a trend, although it's getting pretty close. My recollection was it was close to significant. In fact, people with a low sense of direction almost did worse when we opened up the visibility. My speculation on that is that they actually get a bit overwhelmed. They don't want those extra cues. They don't think they're very good at using them. We're forcing them on these people, and now it's like noise. It's visual noise to them. So I think this is a really important thing for people to keep in mind when they're thinking about the built environment. So not everybody is going to respond to the structure and visibility the same way. Sorry, that's just a description of the results. You can also see this with the pointing task test, although I guess the thing I would just draw your attention to is in the high sense of direction people, this is a very challenging test. And in the beginning, they're not doing very well. But actually, the more they do the task, they pull away from the low sense of direction people. So high sense of direction people get better and better and better with their knowledge of the environment on this very tough test with high visibility, whereas the low sense of direction people, this is how good they're going to be. And you can see, again, they're about 60 degrees off. This is a different task from the one I showed you earlier, but it's kind of the truth. Most of you are going to be about 60 degrees off if you point at something, which is a big error. So one way to sort of think about this is to kind of integrate those observations into a conceptual model of how the environment, the person, how those two things combine to affect how well you can remember and navigate. So in this case, we manipulate the isovist, essentially. We manipulate the visibility of the space, and we measure people's ability, or I would say probably more accurately, their confidence in their ability to use this kind of information. And if you put those two things together, this is how good they are, really, at learning about the space. It's not just the environment, nor is it just the individual trait. It's this interaction between them. So we kind of defined this model, and then we took it a step further. Actually, it was interesting that Dr. Bafna brought up working memory earlier. We said, what about bigger environments? And what about more naturalistic root learning problems? So this is a virtual city we built, and in red, these are different goal locations people had to navigate to. And we played again with the visibility in the space. We gave X-ray vision. We did the same thing. We also played around with the complexity. So like, what if you strip away a lot of the complex textures and you just give people some very simple geometry? It turns out that the visibility was a much bigger factor than the textures, but I won't have time to kind of go into that today. But when we do this, if we return to this question, does reduced visibility hinder your spatial learning? There's an interesting thing to kind of keep in mind, which is working memory. When you navigate from here to here, and you're trying to find that location, you wander this long circuitous route around, you eventually find your goal. That's really hard for you to understand the relationship, the sort of Euclidean relationship between the start and the end. Because you have this long route. That's very demanding on your working memory ability. Your ability to hold information online while you're getting new information and sort of string it all together into the configural knowledge here. So we had this idea that, okay, working memory actually is going to be a really important contributor to your ability to learn. But when we play around with the visibility, that might put more burden on your working memory or less. If you have high visibility, you could actually see from here to here. And it might actually reduce the demands on you to kind of like maintain all the spatial relationships. But in low visibility conditions, you really have to be trying very hard to remember all the turns and steps you took because you can't see all the landmarks that you passed. So we looked at the relationship between spatial working memory and spatial learning, and we asked, is this moderated by this stuff from the study I just showed you before? Is this relationship, how well your working memory predicts your learning, dependent on how hard it is to learn about the layout of the space? And it definitely is, at least in this design. That's a little distracting. But what you can see here is that when the environment is really hard to learn or really easy to learn, the relationship between high working memory and low working memory and how well you learn it's like it doesn't really matter. If it's very hard, you run out of working memory capacity no matter what, and you learn as well as you learn, and that's it. If it's very easy, you almost don't need working memory. But when the environment is kind of hard to learn, but not impossible, that's where people with high working memory have way lower error than people with low working memory. So this is just, again, highlighting that our individual traits, now you've got sense of direction, but you've also got a trait, this cognitive ability of working memory. Those two things are important moderators of any relationship between the structure and how well you learn. So how am I doing on time? I'm good. So you've seen this behavioral data. A question that you might ask then is, well, how did that happen? When you played around with the barriers, why would it have this effect on people? And I'll just foreshadow by saying we haven't done all the studies we need to yet to fully answer this question. But I'll show you kind of a start. So why did the translucency intervention work? If it's reducing the visibility or increasing the visibility, something must be changing in the brain between sort of barrier-full environments and more visibly open environments that has this effect. So this is where we return to the grid cells. Remember that in an open field like this, like a square, you get this nice metric information in all directions. Seems like the perfect thing you need for a map. But in rodents, at least, when you insert barriers and turn this into like a building with hallways, the map actually breaks up. And what you seem to get instead is this pattern of brain activity where it's kind of like there's a yardstick down each hallway, but there's not one two-dimensional map of the space. And in fact, hallways are like missing from this map. Like this neuron does not represent the whole space. But it does seem to tell you on a southbound route how far you've gone. So it's still giving information to the animal, but it's not like a two-dimensional map. So we asked if this is true in people. This is the first step to kind of getting at where those effects of barriers might be coming from. So this is a virtual environment, an open field, and this is another one, it's outdoors. So we asked if it mattered whether it was indoors or outdoors. It didn't. But what we did was we had people navigate these long, circuitous routes through the environment. That's what you're seeing with this pink line. And we measure their grid cell activity. We measure this with fMRI, which Simin will introduce a little bit more later. fMRI can't show us the individual cells firing, but it can give us some information that we need to look at these grid cells. So we measure their grid cells when they're navigating in a big open field. Then we measure it again with the exact same behavior, exact same route, but we've inserted barriers, which you can see here. And this is just to compare with what you see in the rodent data. Again, here's a nice grid cell, And when you force the rat to run the same route, give or take, it becomes almost noise. So what we can do is look at the grid cell-like signals that we get from the brain in humans when they're navigating an open space versus when they're navigating the same space, quote unquote, but now there's barriers inserted. Before showing you the brain data, I just want to highlight a cool feature of this is that we really designed it so the routes are identical. It really is like, if you look at the different angles the people headed in the open and the closed field, it's exactly the same. These two lines here, red and blue, are showing the differences in the two routes that they followed, and they're overlapping. There's just no difference in the routes. Why is that important? Well, I mentioned earlier we've got visibility and affordances. We're not actually playing with affordances here. They're not bumping into the walls. Actually, in the open field, they're mimicking navigating around the walls, even though the walls aren't there. So when we insert the walls, we haven't suddenly changed the way they're going to interact. All we've done is we've changed their visibility. So a different study needs to be done to look at the intervention effect of affordances. But you can see something really significant here. This is how we would measure a grid cell-like signal with fMRI. And what you get is this sort of, it's really much more of a heading angle signal than a grid, but that's a sort of technical point I could talk about offline. But this is what we would sort of consider a grid cell signal, and you get this in the open field. What you can see is when you insert the barriers, the significance values, the color scale is sort of showing you how significant that effect is. It drops dramatically. And instead what we get, oh, this is just a bar plot showing the same thing essentially. But instead what you get is when you move into an environment where they're navigating north, south, and east, west at different intervals, that's it. You get a north, south, east, west type of representation. So we've gone from grid cells firing to something that looks actually a lot like this hallway pattern from rats. So this suggests that in these types of environments, we fundamentally change the way your brain processes headings and distances. And if someone has a more robust grid cell system, perhaps when they're navigating through a space like this, they might be able to maintain a better sort of 2D understanding of the space. But for other people, if this is happening, and this is sort of the average, right? For people where this shifts to really kind of like a hallway-oriented way of thinking about the space, which is probably the average result, maybe your memory for the space is going to be much more about the hallway, what happens in individual hallways, and you have a poor understanding of the overall two-dimensional configuration. So this could help explain why barriers have these sort of effects on our memory. Now, it is worth asking, are barriers really all bad? Like this, I showed you behavioral data showing kind of their suppression of your spatial memory. And I showed you some neural data showing that they break up your map-like grid coding in your brain. This all seems bad. Well, I want to revisit this idea of distorting the geometry and its relationship to memory. There's actually a problem with nice parallel geometry structure. If you take a square like this, the symmetry actually gives you ambiguous information about which direction you're facing. Like, yes, if there are other cues, you can tell if you're facing north or south, but the geometry alone is completely ambiguous. So you don't necessarily know. What's going on with the, there we go. If you're standing in the middle here and you're looking this way, or you're looking this way, the geometry doesn't actually tell you which one. That's not true when the geometry has irregularities in its structure. So this trapezoidal morph of the square has actually solved that problem partly for you. actually potentially entirely, depending on how you give the problem to the person. Now, facing southeast and southwest actually has different geometric features. And so that tells you which way I'm facing right now. And that should really help your memory. If you're trying to learn, was the object here or here in the environment, this seems like the better option for people. But I showed you earlier that grid cells get all warped and skewed in that kind of space. So we've got a problem here again, where there's sort of a psychological view of this type of manipulation that would say, hey, the interesting geometry should help our learning. But then you've got this neuroscience view that's really kind of new and emerging that says, oh, no, you're gonna mess up our understanding of the angles and distances between things when you do this, if we assume that that's all reliant on this grid kind of signal in the brain. So which is it? Well, we've taken the idea that, these things coexist. And we do have these basic neural codes in the brain, but like Dr. Bafna mentioned earlier, they're almost like a perceptual response. There's something that happens automatically. We also have higher order cognition in the way we attend to and think about the environment. So maybe these two things actually work together. And you might assume then that when you're in kind of the wider, more open parts of spaces, the irregular structure, the benefits of that might overcome the costs, especially since the distortion is relatively small in those kind of scenarios. So you might actually see improved spatial memory when you're in kind of bigger open spaces with oddities. But when you're in more narrow, tight corridors and things are really snaking around, the extreme distortion in your kind of ability to map distances and angles is sort of the dominant feature for your memory. So we asked if this is true. We did a virtual navigation study mimicking the rodent data. And here's a view of that. It's a big open field. And we had square environments where people learned where these funny objects went. And we asked them to show us, demonstrate their memory for how, the relative positions of things. And then we warped the environments. So the area is actually the same between these, but and same number of objects and things. But now, these factors are at play. And we asked, what's the impact on memory? You see kind of a working memory type effect in a square. That if you have people start to place the objects along the routes, the very first object they plop down, their error, or SME, which we put here, their error at where it goes is pretty low. The very first object, they're like, yeah, I think it was here. Then they do the next one and they're getting a little bit worse. And the farther you go through the route, the worse people get. So you see this sort of drift upward where as people are going through the route and kind of rebuilding it for us, they get worse and worse by the end. But in the trapezoid, we see quite a different pattern here where actually the way we structured the route was it alternated between the wide and narrow components of the environment. And what you see is that when people are in the wide component, they do quite well. But when they're in the narrow component, their error is rather high. And in fact, it's not super clear visibly here, but people are significantly worse at placing the objects in the narrow part. And they're actually, in some cases, depending on what they're actually slightly better at placing the objects in the wide part of the trapezoid. So the point here is that the geometry, its relationship to your spatial memory is not a fixed factor. It's going to depend a bit on the scale of the space that you're navigating, and to some extent, having irregularities in the space can be beneficial. And in other situations, it can be disruptive. It kind of depends a bit on sort of how much the space is encroached on you to navigate. We had an interesting observation. We measured everybody's sense of direction again. And if you look at the square, what you see is something that makes a lot of sense, which is that people with a better sense of direction do better at learning the route in the square, although it was a fairly weak effect. That goes away in the trapezoid. So I think, personally, this aligns with what you saw from the other study. that the high sense of direction people are actually more sensitive to the visual cues. The problem is, here the visual cues are conflicting with each other and how beneficial they are. So it actually kind of breaks the benefit of sense of direction for learning. In fact, the high sense of direction people show the biggest impairment when they get into the narrow part. So again, I think it's really important that we pay attention to these person factors, because if you have an environment where it's big and open, someone might actually be doing better or worse in these different compartments depending on these other factors. Okay. Wow, despite not having my notes, I'm kind of right on time. That's a miracle for me. So I want to end with just a few sort of future directions that our lab is going. Future directions, also ongoing work. So I already alluded to this. I showed you this study here where we looked at grid-like signals where we obstructed their view, but we didn't actually change anything about the route. Conceptually, we changed the affordances in the space, but we didn't actually change anything for the navigator. Their behavior was unimpaired. So we're interested in now kind of teasing apart that further. So Omar in my lab, who's in the back, he's a postdoc, he's doing a study now where, what if we do the same study, but the walls are invisible and people do bump into them? So now we haven't obstructed their visibility, but we have obstructed their affordances. Do we disrupt the grid coding in the same way or not? Because that's an important thing. We don't really understand. I showed you this potential brain mechanism for why putting barriers disrupts your memory, but we haven't actually really sussed out what it is about the barriers that had that effect. So this is a really cool thing that we're doing now to see whether it's about the knowing where you can and can't go that changes your brain code, or is it because we're changing what you can and can't see? Another thing we're doing is looking at border cells. A cool feature of these environments is when you look at their roots approach and move away from barriers. And from the rodent data, we believe that the reason things like grid cells squish and stretch and warp is that they're downstream from border cells. We think that when your brain says, hey, you're coming up on a border, that helps signal to the grid cells where you are in space. So that's an important question. Is that really true in people? Where do these kind of border signals come from? And are they the ones that predict when our grids get warped and messed up? So it's kind of like focusing more on the mechanism for why we get the effects we do in space. So you can see an example here in the open field. If you go to this particular location, you're a certain distance from two borders. But in the barrier environment, that exact same location, now you're also really close to another border. And we should be able to kind of pick up on the sensitivity of the brain to when you're getting close and far from borders there. And so Omar's been looking at this in the lab as well, and we're kind of getting ready to write this up. This is a broader map of the brain showing different areas that are sensitive to different types of borders. And it turns out, so far from our look at the data, it seems like you can see in green, these are areas that respond in particular to kind of the interior barriers of the space. In red, these are areas that respond to kind of any barrier, including the outer boundary. So one of the things I want to sort of tease you with here is that our brain might make a distinction between where is the limits of my house versus where are the walls within the house. And when you renovate your house and you move the walls, there are certain areas that might be more sensitive to the kind of internal affordances changes. And there are other areas that just don't care about that, but they're anytime you're kind of near the limits of a space, they care about that. I think that's important because different areas get affected by disease and aging differently. And so you might assume that people might respond differently to kind of changes in the structure of an environment differently, depending on the qualities of these different systems. The last thing I wanted to show you is some work from our host, Simin here, who's looking at a really important, a different angle at this problem.
I've been talking about memory as sort of a very simple effect of exploring an environment. You navigate from A to B and you learn that or you don't. But directed learning is an important feature. How much you're really attending to or trying to learn information is going to be a big factor for whether you learn the layout of space or not. So she's revisiting these kind of ideas, like if there's more barriers or less, how well do you learn it? But she's looking at the sort of subjective aspect of this. So how curious are you to actually learn about this space? And if you put more walls in, and if you obstruct your view more, does that make you more motivated to learn and explore? Or does it do nothing? Or does it make you less motivated? So she's got these architectural designs where it's roughly the same kind of outer boundary structure, but she's played around with whether it's an open floor plan with high visibility, high ISOVIS score, or a semi-open where there's a little bit of obstruction, or a closed where it's quite compartmentalized. And what she's seeing so far is also really quite interesting. But one of the things I want to highlight is that it's not the case that open or closed are necessarily the best or worst. It seems like there might be kind of a sweet spot in the middle where a little bit of obstruction is not terribly detrimental to your learning. So this is semi-open versus open, and this is how well they remember. Adding a few walls doesn't hurt you that much, but it actually does dramatically change your kind of affective experience and how curious you are to explore the space. So from an architectural design standpoint, it might be good to kind of, for us to sort of home in on what the sweet spot is for learning. Just a quick callback to sort of the some of the data I showed you earlier. I showed you the working memory relationship to learning was not actually the strongest in the most open visibility or the most closed. It was more in the middle. So no one has made that connection yet, including us in our lab, but it actually occurred to me today thinking about this, that there might be a relationship between this being sort of like a medium difficulty space and that prior observation. So these are things that are important to keep our eyes on. Okay. So I would hate to be the person right before lunch who kept you from lunch. So let me just end with a couple quick sort of take-home messages from this. There is a general trend in our data that barriers to visibility reduce your memory, and they fragment your understanding of kind of the overall map of the space. And you can look at this from the other end. In fact, this might even be sort of an intervention thing where you can alleviate that disruption in VR, put someone back in the obstructed space, and they're actually better, but with some asterisks. So it does depend on their sense of direction. We still don't really know much about the neural mechanism for why, although I showed you it could be about how we're sort of breaking up your brain's mapping mechanisms like these grid cells. Also thinking about the working memory relationship with learning, and then these latest data from Simin, there might be a sweet spot here where some degree of irregularity and some degree of compartmentalization of the space might actually be beneficial, not disruptive. And what we need to do as scientists is kind of pin down where that sweet spot is, and also does it differ from one person to the next, which would really throw a wrench in the works for build design, because you can't change the environment on the fly for different people. So we have to kind of choose where that sweet spot might be for the average population. Yeah, so this could help us build better environments. So I'll end there with just a thanks to all of you for listening, to our funding sources for these various projects. And then Simin mentioned earlier, we have another conference coming up that would be a 2-day thing with multiple talks and poster opportunities. So if you're interested in coming back and maybe sharing some of your work, or just continuing what we're doing today, you can register for that conference here. So